12th May 2022, 6:31 p.m. Literary analysis and study of Inferno. Time check once again, 6:31 p.m. at locale, and continuing from Canto 2, Stanza 1. Day was departing, and the embrowned air released the animals that are on earth from their fatigues, and I the only one. Primary tonal shift, and no sense of a primary tonal shift from the fast-paced, high summary, quick opening to a more intro to contextualization of the contrasting placement of the experience, building the contrast between the experience of exploration and introduction in calmly to near neutral tone, whilst bringing to considerable description or considerable or more vivid description of some of the main conceptualizations relevant to the text, and transitioning to the more passive experiencing, passive description of setting through which the initial context for the following portion of the introduction would occur with. Embrowned air speaks to two aspects. Seemingly bringing attention to a naturalistic interpretation or relevance, or eliciting an awareness of nature as it relates to the following texts, and more so the nature of quieting of state after confrontation, a quieting of an emotional or psychological state after a confrontation, or a progressing or ongoing, and a sense of initiation of a sense of new form being taken. The initiation, or the earliest portion of a sense of a new form being taken or having presence at the context, as described by the context of the embrowned air. Released the animals that are on earth. And an indication that the Canto 2 is going to delve more into the naturalistic aspects and to examine their component qualia more specifically, rather than to use as the analytic analogies applied to description of nature. It's describing it it's introducing the idea that it'll expand into these conceptualizations it'll expand into the qualia of nature, more so, with some degree of category keeping to the prior stated analogies of lion, she-wolf, and greyhound, whilst also inclusive of the presence of self-perspective, but also inclusive of the offerent understanding of circumstantial positioning and narrators self-positioning at the initial setting of Canto 1. It is simultaneously noting that having brought an awareness to these naturalistic aspects and initiated their confrontation, or invoking their conceptualization, that naturalistically the awareness continues forth into further subcomponent examination, as well as to note that after having engaged with that first canto, there is a naturalistic extent by which one would then continue to further confront the more specified onto what is attendant for one to conceptualize or engage with, onto specified aspect, onto what the relevant effectings that nature would have on them, or within the context of nature as itself. Their fatigues, and I the only one. I noticed that it's a notice of appreciation. It's a reinstatement of recognition of speaker and the contrasting role of the conscious and the descriptively capable, or the sentient more directly, in its ability to experience of nature in its wider more complexity, more so than the simpler organic or organisms component. And as stating that, as well as a notance prior to this point, as well as acts as a notance of transition, which speaking to the position that the description and sub-analysis of some further analysis of components of discussion had been explored more indirectly or through more analogous or literary divisive means, rather than more directly, meaning from their fatigues, then saying that these analyses and aspects are going to emerge and be explored in the continuance in their details, as well as a notance that their resting position was of limited context within them, even with some analogizing of it, and to fully delve into, and if delving fully into them would begin henceforth within the contexting. It is also to note that within this context description, within this next canto, the relevant stanzas, even without reference to direct reference to animalistic nature, it would be of useful relevance to maintain continuity of descriptive awareness onto nature metaphor, or the further componentiation of nature as a focus to descriptive or an analytic relevance within the next canto, within this canto of Canto 2. And I, the only one, once again simply stating to note that simultaneously the differentiation and availance of speaker and experiencer, irrelevance and speaking to welcome, and reminder to give us to offer to oneself a self-allowance and accommodativeness to self-considerate experiencing of the following canto, or to be considerate to oneself whilst experiencing the second canto, and then with the higher notance that within oneself the experience is almost analogizing that the experience itself is through transience of a nature underpinning that is self-componentiating within the observer as they exist within transition between state to state and development of position and movement of context and focus to focus. And focus onto alternate afro placement. Made myself ready to sustain the wall, both of the way and likewise of the woe, which memory that errs not shall retrace. Made myself ready to sustain the wall. After notance, offerance of self-accommodativeness, as well as a notance to the recognition of self as the overarching experiencer and viewership of experience within the context, that all of which is through, but is through and with context to one's own ascribed unto a self or recognized perceived self, and then more clearly iterating irrelevance to allow for oneself to have accommodativeness to their own experiencing, accommodativeness to their own intents of experiencing and their own self-position of experiencing as to what with regard their potential intent on perspective in reading, or potential desired or more practically beneficent tending offerant perspective from the engagement with canto or text or description. as well as a notance to begin, as well as simultaneously noting in to of a call to engage some resolve whilst maintaining relevance to the continued reading. But more so, with resolve forthwith the intent of the notance of the increased challenge onto the increased complexity of description required to fully describe upon the text as is, with the focus of accommodativeness to listener and beneficence to listener, in where one may themselves be attempting to analyze the text for self or other. It also gives relevance to. It also gives a sense of awareness that the narrator at the time had some confirmation that they were approaching the further events with a degree of some degree of tentativeness, to the awareness that to the understood awareness that the path followed that they have realized themselves upon would have some challenge, yet simultaneously noting that they have been ready within themselves to approach upon, and to note that they themselves are still treating for the idea of challenge and engaging in cautioned and conservative manner, as evidenced by the choice of the word sustain the war rather than act or conflict the warring. Both of the way and likewise of the woe. To note that both perspectives of awareness of both of the way, Simon is speaking that readying oneself for challenge is appropriate. Self-accommodation is appropriate, and a notance of description whilst maintaining thorough characterization and cautioned beneficent intent being the tertiary, are simultaneously, those three things simultaneously being goodly self-direction or effective self-direction, onto the further readings and analysis and perceival of text, as well as noting that with preparation of challenge, it suggests it gives the initial offerance of, with preparation and self-accommodation to challenge, brings forth the initial awareness that in preparing for a challenge, one would then be modifying of oneself to suit tasking rather than experiencing within a inert and or freely receptives or an inertly receptive state or inertly self-position, or with regard to accommodating, it's that one would then have to lose some of their fervorance in confrontation or contemplation at depth, therefore detracting some of the substantiveness of the text and reading, and they both with their relevant disadvantage, both with their relevant minor disadvantage, minor or note minor yet necessitatedly noted side effects or adverse side effects or counterpart, and with regard to the awareness, with regard to mind, and more simply a notance in the further form of an analytic descriptive function that a woe can be gotten or a disheartenment can be gotten from kindly phrasing by simply by bringing awareness onto the bringing descriptive conversational awareness onto the relevant challenging aspects of the text, and cautioning or forewarning of cautioning toward beneficent accommodativeness or subtle tellings, or forewarning of a notance of thorough engagement with the with the more impositous aspect of text as they would be experienced. I use the word impositous simply to suggest that any aspect would be bringing forth an awareness of a conceptualization that can have the effect of an alterance of perspective in the varied degree of form an alterance of perspective can be enshaped or intake or had in witherance or through with which memory that is not shall retrace. With that prior description, it's denoted, it's the first initiation. It's a further categorization of a change in awareness to the aspect of awareness that can be had as memory of likened effect or likened experiencing as it may pertain, as well as to note that some may themselves have limited capacity to conceptualize some of the aspects of the goodly nature, rather potentially from inexperience, or the understanding of the present of adversity, described adversity or the afflictus aspect of human condition that will be explored upon within the following. It's also a self-caution unto reader to be prepared for evocation of potential memories or perspectives that may hearken to some negative emotive state or less desired emotive state, less desirable emotive, desired or desirable emotive state. And to note onto those who themselves would miss some aspects of description or lack or feel or have the sense that they are not fully conceptualizing of the description offerant, that the venue and the primary venue through which understanding can be gained is the virtuous re-encountering, self-tasking onto gaining an understanding of the text and components that they recognize or they would hear but miss. More directly stating, it is some aspects would be heard but not conceptualized, and to gain an understanding of them, one would then have to revisit and process through the conceptualization, to afford themselves such an understanding. O muses, O high genius, now assist me. Similarly, it also notes that descriptor themselves, by use of the word retrace, cannot offer a one-to-one conceptualization forth, but simply can guide onto the process of conceptualizations. meaning that of a listener, like onto what any relevant experiencing, one would then have to have engagement with self directive and enactioned engagement with contexting or action itself as for any given experiencing to fully be within receival of, to fully self-avail onto the variated or magnitudinous aspects of experiential component. O muses, O high genius, now assist me. I is stating to simply call on to one's self-peace or one's internalized peace, one's self-perception of form guidant or guiding form, or one's self-perception of functionable form capable of guidance, a form functionable onto guidant, guidant ascription. And the notance that also plainly noting that the rhyming pattern of the text itself is offerings of some emotive assist through the experience of a reading. Further noted that O high genius, then stating that conceptualization itself is recommendable as the primary means and primarily beneficent means, rewarding means by which an experiencing of the text can be had, and a gainful and attainment of gainful state or gainful prospect on the relevant conceptualizations would occur with through. Simply the act of conceptualization alone is offerant of some betterment towards capacitation, towards peaceful or joyous or enlightened development through the reading, throughout reading, or the text. And now assist me is prominent calling with the exclamation mark to further note the rhyming thematics, as well as the welcomedness for oneself to seek an offerance or an accommodation of an appeasement or a guidance on towards the engaging with any relevant challenge doth before them. O memory that didst write down what I saw, here thy nobility shall be manifest. Also further noting the ascribance of an existential derivation between self-income of the romance within itself, within romantic pairing, as it pertains towards the perceival of guidance and actionability, or appropriate and actionability untoward, companioned functioning, or companioned cohesivity. Remember that it is write down what I saw here, thy nobility shall be manifest. Here thy nobility shall be manifest is a notance that even through a more challenging aspect of interpretation, conceptualization, or experiencing, one can find of they perceive it a guidant, and in nature imparting and can perceive of beneficent perspective, perceive of goodly self-kindly nature, self-kindly can perceive onto the goodly aspects of nature, or direct onto oneself in kindly manner, or others, direct onto others in kindly manner, from with their position within any given experiencing or challenge. It's also speaking to more directly to the relevance of conceptualization and perspective on and information as it exists, as a note that to state in nobility it's speaking to, it simultaneously hearkens to the magnitude and immediately hearkens to the magnitude and of effective capacity of the nature of information, conceptualization, and perception. And it's with regardance and caution unto the significance of effectivity that it may have in upon notance in any regard towards its effectiveness, with further noting that by manifesting it is stating that it's thy nobility shall be manifest. Manifest is stating that its aspect of nature, it is simply of nature, that one would have effect upon them by an engagement with action or information. And to note that thy nobility shall be manifest and to note that once again, manifest is a first notance or callback to memory from even from within the stanza itself to the prior statement of write down what I saw and assist me, of the thematic nature of the stanza, to hearken on to oneself for kindly ascribance of meaning or kindly conveyance of context, kindly intending conveyance of context. And I began, poet who guidest me, regard my manhood, if it be sufficient, ere to the arduous pass thou dost confide me. Thou sayest that Silvius the parent, while yet corruptible unto. And I began, poet who guidest me, regard my manhood, if it be sufficient, ere to the arduous paths thou dost confide me. And I began, poet who guidest me. First notance that it is not through self alone through which an offerance of conveyance or guidance should be recognized, but through self, nature and existent, that hearkened onto through experiencing, or the likenable inspiration, or a birthine aspect encompassing, as prior stated, as well as to note the appropriateness of venuing, or a further end calling, or the notance that a conceptualization is requitant of the self, by stating that, and I began, then they state, poet who guidest me. It is noting that of a guidant perceived higher, of a higher perceived guidant can only be simply that. Rather, the self enacting would have to be engaged in processing for the in service of growings or development within one's own self-perspective through the text, or conceptualizability through the text. And simultaneously noting as that would apply, as all that also applies to the relevance of a guide and an assistant and a supporter in regarding any given challenge or experiencing. Regard my manhood. It's an asking for cautions. It's a simultaneously an asking and reminder, and asking for oneself and a reminder on to listener for a perceived accommodativeness, for the perceived necessary accommodativeness towards positioned engagement, or wherever life might have them. As well as the notance of a degree of self-directive onto increased constitution for engagement with deepening a more confronting aspect of conceptualization, or memory, or remembrance, or emotive dealings that would or could be brought about through text. And a notance that where unassailing is towards where resolve is unassailing, we have offerings unto self and accommodation. We have offerings unto self and mercy towards peace and understanding. That all challenges are not for all at any given time. Here to the arduous path. Firstly, it's a notance of the relevance to maintain the consistency of the text and conceptualization, or the text and descriptions conveyed. It's a notance that if one strays too far into derivative understanding, one may then find themselves at some receival of misconception. But once one maintains conceptualization of the adversity, of the adversity scaled to the derivative, scaled or companioned with the derivative interpretation, one's dense gain of the conceptualized the benefit towards perceptualizations. Of the relevant descriptions or understandings, as well as noting that the reading and that despite the text bringing pause at times of confrontation or challenge, emotively or descriptively, one can then find a placement of offerant, resolve or respite, or alleviation of tasking, alleviation of demanding, or if one is to continue the read within the tonality, as well as notance of, as well as with useful, with a comma, as well as less directly stated but relevant to note. That again reminding that at some level of rhythmic flow eases the passing of interpretation, once to which one might self-ascribe, and regarding rhythmic flow it is to which one might self-ascribe as appropriate for one's benefit. Thou dost confine me, Simul, is notes that it's a call, so again, calling on to one's is again noting a more tangible perspective onto calling of a sense of internalized peace for engagement with conceptualizedly challenging, or challenging as it pertains, as well as a reminder for those who seek it, the place of guide into higher scribance, solely, as well as for those giving offerings of perspective for higher conceptualization of guidance, rather than their own internalized, rather than an internalized sense of peace, is to be allowant onto the guide for limitation in an action, or in limitation in momentary supportiveness, if one is conceptualizing a higher that they perceive as of guidance to them. Also relevant at that point is to note it is precedential to have an internalized sense of peace. But for those with ascribance of a higher, but whilst noting that the simple benefit, the simple and very direct benefit of having an internalized sense of peace, one can also have a further sense of perspective and respitance from their conceptualized higher guidance, if they themselves ascribe, if they are of ascribance to that, if they themselves are in belief of such, or are benefited by the perception of such, clearly stating, directly advising to have work on to internalize sensation, a sense of peace, as well as noting that if you also have also see yourself as benefiting from perceptualization of higher guidance, you can do that as well and have that be a primary guide, and have that be of service and consideration. But ultimately, you're perceiving of, ultimately, there's benefit to perception of all three, of perception of both those two things, or holdance to both those two things in conceptualization, as well as to note with the offerance, the use of poet, arduous pass, sufficiency, as well as to note of the relevance within stanza, that the beneficence that it can be had from information assimilation alone, or pieced interpretation, pieced perspecting, or the existence of, or the offerance of an ability, or the nature within conceptualization alone, regarding its spend, can serve as the relevant, perceived, higher guidance, if once isn't required, if once as relevant as perceive it as higher guidance, if once is not an ascribance to other derivated or specified. Thou sayest that of Silvius the parent, while yet corruptible unto the world, mortal went and was there bodily, is the querying of the perceived, of the perceptible contradiction unto an understanding that nature and that the naturalistic aspect and a valence of conceptualization can be offerant of the desired joyous positioning or peace. From text. Or more simply in general. But more generally as well. But then more simply in general. Whilst corruptible unto the world, Silvius the parent, nature, birthine, nature, birthine, nature, scripting, a scriptant. Corruptible unto the world, mortal went, and there was bodily, is to state that it is simultaneously noting unto those without and of resolvedness to self-engage, would benefit from a recognition, or simply benefit, or can continue in text, or continue with their experiencing, while noting of the benefit of recognizing or considering for the contribution, the potentially positive contribution that can be had from questioning or conceptualizing onto the furtherant aspect, whilst noting with regard to how it can be perceived if one would be perceiving or enacting through resolved self-engagement or direction. What if the adversary of all evil was courteous, thinking of the high effect that issued from him, and who and what? What if the adversary of all evil was courteous, thinking of the high effect? And a reminder that if one is perceiving of themselves, is engaging through perception with the context that they would be beneficent of self-resolvedness, rather than engaging onto self-conceptualization resolvedly. One might then be affected through that means, as perceiving of oneself in self-diminishment within the conceptualization of an alternate form or an alternative aspect that they would perceive as capable or capacitous to toward directed or engaged confrontation or cooperant action alongst the relevant text. And it's reminding that once again peace is found internal and only had through taking. Or blessing. And as well as with notance that to be an actor of an affordance, to be an actor of an affordance of a blessing, once may thence have to find a peace through an encapting of withinst their own perceived adversing's. To men of intellect, unmet it seems not, for he was of great Rome and of her empire. Unmeet not, unmeet it seems not, unmet it seems not, for he was of great Rome and of her empire, and of her empire. It is a notance that with maturation comes the awareness that all growings and all benefit of self is requirement of some personal involvement or engagement towards the purpose of facilitation of such development against with as well as noting that not all persons are at the same capacitous position or maturation of handling, capacitous engageability or maturation of handling when approaching with these texts, but reminding that it is an aspect of a living, it's an aspect of life and through, and that one is available to offer an accommodation for oneself to what they're positioned at, it would be appropriate to do so. But if one is doing so, to simultaneously note that if one wants furtherance of perception and conceptualization, one would then have to note what might be more seasoned perspective one aspect might be, or what might be more directly stating what a more encompassing descriptive aspect or interpretation might be relevant. And with notance onto writer, there is notance onto the perceivance of the writer within text, the narrator and speaker, that their position in capacity for guidance is of a fortune. But simultaneously noting it is an fortune onto capacitation of service to the natured offerance of the intellect, natured offerance of the intellect or the enlightenment or appeasement, or more specifically, the natured offerance. With aspect of nature entailed in viewership and understanding, being aspect of nature specified as to relevancy with its inclusivity of its subsistential requirement, as well as the tenuous prospect through which its beneficent perspective, oft tenuous perspective, through which its beneficent perceival can be noted. It likens the same onto perceptions of similarly as relevancy as it applies to any guide appropriate, as well as the conflictions with sensibilities toward jealousy that may come regarding perspective on beneficial, on another's affordance, capacitation, or blessedness. In the imperial heaven as Father chosen, and a reminder once again of the impetus towards service and beneficence in the arduous task of offerance of a teaching or a self-conceptualization and working, with notance of variated aspects of nature, an aspect, the the multitudinously variated aspect and experiencing through which an individual may be placed within for engagement and contexting and conduction for engagement of text or learnings or their life or with their life through. It is a note that to state that whence we may find ourselves lowly, a peace can be found lowly or placed low. A peace can be found in the offerance of a requitance onto the simple passings or continuance of nature, as well as through the self-direction, and notably with its relevancy to self-direction, onto hope for peace, and the direct inclusion of perception of divinity one may be ascribed to. That which and what wishing to speak the truth, the which and what, which specifically relevant describing the directing articles, with your directing include the more specifically directing onto the more specifically serving and clearly directing aspect of text, and the what referring to the conceptualizingly challenging aspect of interpretation, as well as with relevance to the what's inclusion of aspect of a sense of otherness, of the relevancy of the senses of otherness onto onto aspects of description or relevant text that may have a sense of otherness about it, as well as noting, followed by the wishing to speak the truth, that the what is of the higher purposedness of meaning, because what is as evidenced by the relevancy of the word what as an instigation of a questioning, whereas which is an instigation of a description. But also noting that which first, that the use of which first is functional for has functionality for proclamative, propositives, proclamative, or propositus, self-directive, of understanding upon one's internalization of meanings from text or descriptions. Wishing to speak the truth. It's a note that the text itself is attempting to convey substantive meaning, whilst doing so in and now with utilization of analogy and literary devising, while simultaneously noting that when recognizing the relevancy to engagement with the otherness of some aspects of perception, whilst engaging with aspect of perception that is seen that an offset can be seen as of limited purposiveness towards goodly increase, one's would then have to take pause to recognize. One's may then have to take pause to recognize that they too, that the aspects where goodly intent cannot clearly be seen or noted or easily noted, are as well giving of some context to goodly aspect of nature. Who established as the holy place there wherein and a notance of caution unto further enactment of perceived aspect that is with notance of or bolstering of the enserving awareness of the adversions of existence, adversities of an existence. That when recognizing and acting forth or being in receival of the influence of the text and that increased awareness of the adversities of existence, one is then cautioned further on towards taking action that is potentially, that may be of potential detriment or haste forth, or to greatly haste from the perspective they may have at a time. Meaning that you may learn to recognize some things from engagement with text and meaning, but as a point, your conceptualization may be limited, and it may cause you to act inappropriately or rashly, or you may enable yourself to do such, or as well as to note that in general one should take purposive intent on toward goodly action, as well as to note the aspect of the further degree of complexity, even amidst even with complexed or detailed understanding or interpretation, that the most beneficent of action is akin to a placement from a high servicing, and to be in remindance of simplicity of one's own and mortality in existence. When challenging oneself to enactments based on their learnings and understandings in any regard. And once again noting, mention to a saint. Or a saintly, or and as well as with use of the word successor, it is suggesting that even with description and bolstering of the awareness of the relevant adversities within a life, one's beneficence unto an utterance of learnings is suggested by narrator of saintly lichen. Teaching is great. In simplicity, learning is also similarly thus. Being kind is wonderful. Being patient is virtuous. Being methodical is wise. Being accommodating is loving. And being in offerance of a peace is pristine. Or being of a seeking unto peace, beneficence is pristine. Maybe not pristine. Pristine is reasonable. Within one's own. Pristine within one. Pristine within one's own. Nicely noted. On this journey, whence thou givest him vaunt, things did he hear, which the occasion were, both of his victory and of the pall mantle. Again noting that whence givest him vaunt, it is saying that we may oft feel emboldened, or profoundly uplifted at moment by the encountering or availance of self through a given challenge or emotively confronting aspect. As with noting that that is itself a good thing and goodly towards oneself, but with reminder of the prior caution unto one's actions. Forth such a position, as well as this point noting that our learnings are incremental and continuant, meaning that there's always room for betterment in simple, as it pertains to learning, conceptualization, perception, or beneficent directive or action, when actionings. And the use of the journey there is a further call to self-appeasing, or or an upliftment upon recognizing that such a thing is part of what gives life, what oft can be seen as 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 componently offerant of meaning within life, or joy enlightening, or enlightenment in peace. This did he hear. This as well as to note that guide alone, in any form, is not enabling, but of prescription of a transience that may afford a salience or an valence. Things did he hear, which the occasion were. Again, that's coupled with the prior statement about the guide regardance of the guide's aspect of transience. But also, more primarily, it is with notance that, again, with further notance that we will oft pick up things, even where we pick up something, an avenue for improvement. There's regularly irrational furtherant improvement that can be made upon position. And that to have any incrementation, have any increment and development within that regard is worthily celebratory. And reminder that at that point of celebration, celebrate the event once would also benefit from the awareness that once can celebrate the availance of further or new opportunity for learning or development, having incrementation or a growth attained, improvement attained. Growth or improvement attained, both of his victory and papal mantle. What am I looking at? In case. That's all that's there. In case one would question. Well, the aspect of theirs with relevance to be the perception of the availance of depth of understanding, in that it is of great in comparison, that developing of an understanding is greatly increasing, oft perpetually requiring a furtherance. And that it is a thing to be appreciable unto oneself for, as well as to note in similar likening that one is to recognize a perceivance of a guidance from a higher one is to recognize a perceivance of a guidance from higher conceptualization or from higher conceptualized form of overseer. As having aspect of indirectness or overarchedness onto a life, rather than as overarchedness onto the nature of life and existence, rather than onto one's self directly regarding an availance of a learnings. It is all to the availance of dust's growings within existential and mortal nature. But it is most oft to note that it is that there is presence for an indirectness and overarchedness of guide. That one then is to remind themselves to add a degree of self-awareness when designating upon oneself appropriate action or appropriate pathing for appropriate growth, development through which revelation is had, or instillment of spiritualistic peace might be gained. Further noting that then reminding onto the imperative furtherance, self-engagement within action towards sustainment of such development of conceptualizability or intellect, or sustenance or developments of one's own peace, internal or existential, or the peace existential as it is, or maybe by 5/12/2022, 12th of May 2022, 8:06 p.m. Canto 2, Inferno, stanzas 1 to 9. 12th May 2022, 8:07 p.m. Continuing Canto 2, onto stanza 10. Thither went afterwards the chosen vessel, to bring back comfort thence unto that faith, which of salvation's way is the beginning. Thither went afterwards the chosen vessel. It is with notance that withdrew any action or aspect of nature or experiencing or guide. There is an offerance of a learning, but there is a requirement of an awareness of the context with a requirement of an awareness of the serviced context or nature inapplicability of the aspect or factor within that regard, for the purpose of noting that any factor is itself acting by its own nature, any factor of its influence is acting and exerting an influence upon by its own nature. And it is oft with beneficent relevance to hold oneself, to have a holdance of oneself to a degree of maintenance of awareness of that nature's enactment as it pertains, as well as that note with relevance to literal furtherance of conceptualizing, literal guide onto how metaphors used and analogies placed can be interpreted as they would further come up in text. As well as the writer noting that they have themselves, the writer or speaker themselves, the writer or a speaker or descriptor and guide would themselves be an offerance of a teaching from a perspective onst a nature or learned descriptive aspect. Or intelligent descriptive aspect. To bring back comfort thence unto that faith. It is a reminder that at times whence resolvedness is unavailing again, that once may be to benefit by once may best act towards beneficence of self or other, by bolstering their understanding of they're bolstering of that which they are already have perceptual consolidation within, as it pertains to the aspects of an understanding. Where adversity is greatly limiting, as well as to note in general that the relevancy of reiteration and bolstering the principle, the underpinning principalities of actions and moralities as they pertain to gaining a perspective on anything regarded. And an advisement to seek abasement in one's understanding or inaction of the principalities of morality as relevant. Which of salvation's way is the beginning? That's a confirmation of relevance of understanding onto principalities of morality. But I, why thither come, or who conceits it? I not enas am, aenas, aeneas, aeneas. I am not Paul, nor I nor others think me worthy of it. This is a cautioning against self-deleterious, self-diminishing speech or self-diminishing perspective, and a bolstering and reminder unto one's confidence in capability to have upholdance towards the relevance, towards the taskings of goodly nature, and a reminder of capability with focus onto further conceptualizations of relevancy, of improved or increased conceptualizations developing within oneself, developing such capacity within oneself. Or noting that a teacher or a lesson is itself not a reminder that a teacher or a lesson itself is not the ascribing factor, is not the instilling factor of a learning or an understanding or venuing of self-improvement, but rather it is aspect of nature through a conscient, an inconscient self-improvement and conscient act unto self-improvement and sustainment and goodly nature exists with through, or exists by means of, or simply put, that the magnitude, the scale of the lesson in offerance is not indication of separation or incapacitation, but rather a reminder that it is coming from the principalities that are accessible to that are bolsterable, that are readily self-bolsterable, and often easily accessible to easily availed for withholdance to action untoward. And noting that the true act of learning or improvement that is had within oneself does not come from the lesson that was taught or the teacher that may offer it, but of thine own experiencing of meaning that therein may lie, and to note that that aspect of lesson noted of noted meaning is all that would be assimilated. I not Aeneas am, I am not Paul. Further on subnote, same context towards the relevancy of lesson and learnings. With general context to any influential factor or internalized perception via guidance form. Nor I nor others think me worthy of it. It's a more direct statement. It's a confirmation that is an appropriate note to recognize the depletion of self-perspective that can be had by comparative understanding or comparative viewership of oneself to other that may be more experienced or intelligent yet intelligent or learned. Whilst simultaneously noting, calling to some sense of appreciability or awareness and appreciability ontoward the immortal aspect of growth an existence that is available and may be an offerance, and were beneficent for those who would ascribe of themselves, a subtle promoting of a hope that can be viewed through morsel aspect. Hope in subtly noted or more large X, but a hope in its simplicity as well as its appertainedness. Appertainedness. Or a hope unto larger, a hope unto greater, a hope unto furtherance, or a hope unto a furtherant. If that more clearly offers the suggestible hope within that can be offered, as the more clearly describes a hope that can be had within perspective on mortality and finality, finitude. Thou art why, therefore I resign myself to come. So notice that as a living and experiencing and a working through, one would then have to ascribe of oneself a degree of withholdance or a degree of self-limitation onto a perspective of incompletion or limit, an awareness of limited capacity, of potential for limited capacity, of the portent of limited capacity regarding impartability as it may pertain. And more simply a reminder onto a humbleness and viewership of or engagement with the text as it may be had, and viewership of and a humbleness when approaching the engagement with the aspects of text that describe of the subsistencings of nature, or the positionings or the experiencings of those, or the experiencing had as with result therein, as they are described in the language. what is described in the text. To note, simply state more clearly, is an advisement to not compare or place oneself too highly above those experiencings of any relevant misfortune, and to maintain one's sense of likened aspect with any that one would present themselves alongside, or one might find themselves alongside, or be in observation of. As well as with that specific mortal relevancy. And the notance that specifically the resignation onto humility is itself positively contributing towards one's availance of furtherance of understanding or beneficent inactability or capacitation, or that it oft is. But more so it's relevant, but more specifically rather than humility, it is the notance of similitude of person aspect. I fear the coming may be ill-advised. Thou art wise, and knowest better than I speak. With the secondary meaning that one may likely view themselves as placed within this path existentially, or they're placed within a life circumstance and that their placement within it is only availing to a limited or a self-limiting, avails a limited set of venue through which one can have some respite or overcoming of it. With regard to the viewership of the relevancy of an overcoming of a challenge in that sense, it is with notance that a surpassing of a position or any growings out of a given state once again comes with the inclusion of a separation or a degree of separation from prior state from which they had grown. And persons may themselves feel times uncertain as to whether a directive of overcoming would within their interest, or may perceive that the action more pointed or action more greatly affect and actions that are greatly affecting to circumstance of situation, such as an action that is perceived beneficent, is met with a degree of uncertainty as to whether or not it is truly or optimal for them to intake, or with some warning for the change in state that occurs naturally through the requirements of growing within a life and promotion and continuance onto larger tasking or challenge, as well as it applies to respite. It is the finding of allowance of forgivability to a sense of regret. There is a sense of regret that can be had in a lack of alternation onto a furtherant self-designation, meaning that we may find ourselves being described with a degree of despondence by our shortcomings, or with resignation onto a settlement of a matter or issue that is affecting one, that may be affecting oneself. As well as to note the consolation to both positions that wherein it is a happening, and a happening onto a development within transience itself, assailed or salient. That simply always has the availability of consolidating of a piece within position, as it may present a further offerance or venuing for growth thereafter. Thou art wise, and knowest better than I speak. And as he is, thou art wise, and knowest better than I speak. once again offering to place a degree of an affordance of respite, an affordance or allotment of availability to seek respite in a guide or guidant aspect, as well as more simply to allow of aspect that burdens that is burdening rest within the awareness that the development can come of it within time, or that we may simply find comfort in the aspect of existence and nature's imperative furtherance of benefit of its capacity of the existential capacity for beneficence as it pertains to finding a perspective on appeasement or security against mortality in concept, or well as more simply as it pertains to a relevancy of guidance within a companionship. It is the imperative. It is the effect. It is the notance of effectivity or effectiveness of a simple ascribance of love as being self-guidant. Of love as being self-guidant. And as he is who unwills what he willed, and by new thoughts doth his intention change, so that from his design he quite withdraws. It is a notance of the aspect of within mortal perspectives on mortality. It is a notance that the experience of a life as it was had, or as it is had, and as it had been within our circumstances, and we are formulated by thus, and we are oft most peaceably designated, most afforded of peace, in perspective of furtherant viewership with notance of the prevalence of a beneficent aspect of nature, where unjust action is seen, where unjust action is occurrent, as a means of reassurance onto a perceived future and development of that which is and will be, with or without it. And it regards again within companionship, the idea of companionship, that the idea of love itself is directing and greatly affecting and profoundly motivating. Yet at times it is an advisement that the awareness of such profound motivation that can come from it can and is available to uptake as a venue, or available to internalize as a venuing or a personed peace within oneself, rather than a ascribance onto the sensibility of necessitation for which a love that is had to be sailing. It is an advisement onto appreciation of the existence of a love capacitas in its transience, as protection against salient or unassailing connection. It's also noting that it is oft less appropriate to blame oneself, to greatly blame oneself for insufficiencies of effectiveness within a companionship or experiencing, rather to note the understanding of an experience as within a transience of state to state and development to development, as it may be cyclic, or as it may be described as cyclic. As a means of finding restful perspective in challenges or experiencing had, or in perception of what might be seen as existential tasking, or purposely designate, as well as with relevancy to the doctrinal perspective therein. And it is with purpose to the relevancy, and in new thoughts doth his intention change, is with purpose to relevancy, the recognition that persons oft direct their guidance onto the guidance of an affordance of a betterment towards their understood, which may come from doctrine or ideology or philosophy or naturalistic perspective. We would note the effective, one would note the salience of all those perspectives amidst each other, meaning that they can all be likenedly availing, with notance of the precedentiality of the moral principalities and kept. And that from his design he quite withdraws. It speaks to the sense that in times and taskings, and when faced with adversity, we often find ourselves with a sensibility that there is no venuing or respite or overcoming, or that we had simply been, or that more than we are capable of tolerating had been placed on us. That in that position we find ourselves greatly diminished. But it speaks the awareness as such can happen, as well as it speaks to the awareness that one can always redirect oneself towards internalized sense of peace, or developing of one's capacity or intelligibility of a self-directive through which one can gain a handling on their experiencings, meaning that we can always find peace in ourselves, or we can always go to a venuing for a learning, or we can always go to a venuing that we perceive it as a consolidation of a respite to circumstance. That we ourselves, at the point of making a decision to such, are again within a state of transient growth, and the change therein is to be, and the decision or actions therein to be therein as they may be afforded when taken is with degree of forgivability unto self, or accommodative or sense of held with a sense of accommodativeness of self as we are, as we find our, or as we grow through, or as we oft grow it through. Such I became upon the dark hillside, because in thinking I consumed the emprise, which was so very prompt in the beginning. It speaks to the awareness that we may always, that in any circumstance we may find ourselves in the awareness that we could have engaged or applied more of ourselves towards its improvement. It reiterates that aspect and noted a degree of consolidation of, and noted a degree noted the relevancy of appreciation onto what improvement had been had by decision made or venue taken, whilst reminding of a keeping to a self-awareness of the potential for venuing for furtherance that had been had, could be had in future, in likened or otherly applicable. It's in no sense that even where we may have acted appropriately or seen as having been gained of some improvement, overcoming one circumstance, we would of ourselves also have a degree of remindance that the availance had or offerant as it may pertain towards the surface or servicing is of itself within some limitation, meaning we have a resolution to which only so much can be attainable. When one may be off a scrap, maybe it is naturalistic for one to be off a scripted onto resolution, the limitation, potentiality of outcome. And in that, too much, and within that, we may find ourselves overtaken by sentiments, by sensibilities of rewardedness from the effort or the achievements, or as it pertains to an offerance, we may find ourselves we may find that our actions had been of some diminishment of the finite venue through which learning can be had, or may find that such as it may apply to a teaching being offered, that such as example as a case being offered, a caseation, an exemplary being offered, that causes limitation onto which the receiver of the exempling it then gains sense of restriction onto likened, and as well as a diminishment of perspective that such capacitation can be enactable through themselves as they are in their developmental path, rather than what they might perceive as an effective mirroring of pathing of the exemplary. Which was so very prompt in the beginning. And a reminder, once more, of the ever-availing relevance, seeking of oneself, and development through the development of oneself with the availing contexts and learnings, or alongside, as one might perceive. As it regards a precautioning against finding of oneself within position where one's basedness may be unassailing amidst experiencing, or that or otherwise it is a reminder of the relevancy of maintaining the openness of accessibilities of available understandings within a context, and awareness of the fluidity of change that may be relevant to any given experiencing. Often, to give further elaboration, or to give comparative or interlinking elaborations, the narrator had initially found themselves in a position in their life where, at the initial setting, had found themselves in a position in their life where they were faced with challenge that they had sensibilities towards enactment or actionability against, but had come to a point of complete depletion of sense of capacity to actualize any real effect therein, and felt themselves deleted, felt themselves being depleted. And with them, it speaks to the awareness that such aspect, such relevant, that such circumstances within life and such displacements in life can happen more readily and almost spontaneously as they may be affecting. And it notes the relevancy of consolidation and preparedness, or consolidation or effectiveness of preparedness, or consolidation in resolving on towards sustaining. That is to better state, consolidation onto relevance of an understanding or an actability that is furtherantly sustaining and sustainable. As a summarized guide, a summarized interpretation of guide of front end stands in that stanza. It also notes that we may oftentimes be prompt, we oftentimes may be hasty to direct venuing or to direct or ascribe or ascript a venuing that is consolidated onto a given understanding or pathing. And in which that awareness acts as a reminder of the relevancy of the variatedness of affectings and experiencings, as well as the potentiality for action abilities or means through which appropriate handling can be had, as well as that there is always further optimal causal means of availance. If I have well thy language understood, replied that shade of the magnanimous, thy soul attained is with cowardice. I have well thy language understood, cried that shade of the magnanimous, thy soul attained is with cowardice. It is of no sense to read of indication that even within descriptance and guidance, one might find appropriateness of action to furtherantly read into the contexts available, and more so again reiterating the relevance of elaboration for oneself, on of self-engaged elaboration of conceptualization evident by the prepositus relevant evidenced by the choice of conjecture of speech used to state self-affordance of self-perceival, self-development of an understanding within that context. As well as to note that after such a confronting stanza of the past, that was the prior stanza, one would then have advisement on to rebase oneself onto consolidated onto consolidated understanding upward from principality of morality. The use of the word magnanimous being with notants, of more clarity of noting of the variated complexity conceptualization offerant the descriptive and the wide descriptive or wide perceptible aspect through which text can be taken or learnings or learning can be taken or experiencing can be had, or reference the or otherwise the enigmaticness of the human drive to companion and its ascribable or its describable greatly form in love, or as well as it may pertain to its describable greatly form of love to better state. It also speaks again with an indirect relevancy to consolidation of resolve and face a challenge while simultaneously noting a sense of commoditiveness to be held forth oneself and forth the other, and forth another, and affordable to another, with regardance to opposite interactions, or engagements like, or describe disagreements more simply. It also notes it brings an awareness to the perceived sense, the perceptibility of a weakness in that position, but it rather notes the ascribance of the furthermost functionability towards incapacitation of beneficent operability towards one's capacitation, functionability towards one's capacitation onto another's beneficent operability within their own comes primarily or primordially from an understanding or the principalities of morality, or as they are described and as they are describant of highest guidant conceptualization or higher guidant conceptualization. Right. It it notes that as an ascribance to organs of the awareness that it itself is the designate for is the designate venue for which one can find of their own consolidation and position amidst uncertainty and transience. Which many times a man encumbers, so returns him back an honored enterprise. dost love thou art, narrowing purposings, dost love thou canst be, to an narrowment of purposings, and twist profoundance, salient within silence, which many times a man can bestow his confirmation of the relevancy of description of, of relevance, that reiterating after the description of how one can consolidate themselves amidst with tasking forth an opposition, that they can find that of their own human aspect or human emotive circumstances or naturalist or human aspect as it may be, regarding emotive as it may regard emotive tendencies, that we can find ourselves having had some extent. It, it's a notance of the awareness of of how humanity can affect us, and our emotive tendencies can guide forth as well as guide forth and guide seemingly forwardly with potential for some hindrance, and that is that it is in some sense natured to be in seeking, and as well as how that may pertain to perceived venues of availance, as well as how that might influence or confound upon oneself or another regarding with regards to choices of actions taken and their resulting effects. It is simultaneously called, again, onto an allotment, and simultaneously advise onto caution, advise onto the caution and relevancy of self-awareness, as well as an allotment for our human shortcoming in any aspect as it pertains, as well as to note of some shortcoming, and as well as to note that effort to shortcoming is valued, as effort is at least is shouldest be at least valued as effort made, an effort offerant, and remindance of, and furthermore, with furtherance onto an advisement of a degree of self-appreciation for the for our position within, our comings and developments through our existence within the human condition. Surmount of thine own self.